everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Aaron McGuire, and I'm the Executive Director of Friends at Baxter State Park. Our focus tonight is on the scientific forest management area. As an organization, we focus a great deal on Governor Baxter's Forever Wild vision and the park's wilderness values, and rightly so. But in addition to wilderness, Percival Baxter's vision also included sustainable forestry. And as he was assembling the park, Baxter designated 30,000 acres in the northwestern corner of the park as the Scientific Forest Management Area, or SFMA. And we are very fortunate to have 4 expert speakers join us tonight to help us better understand this special part of Baxter State Park. But first, I want to introduce our Deputy Director, Mary Weitzman, who's here on the screen. Mary is going to be monitoring the chat. So if you're having any technical issues, having trouble with your audio or video, have any questions about the Zoom interface, Mary is here to help, and we'll be in the chat. Thanks, Mary. So our first speaker tonight, and I'm going to invite our 4 speakers for this evening to turn on their video and come on screen while I introduce you if you'd like to. Our first speaker tonight is Alec Giffen from Chelsea, Maine. Alec is a licensed forester, a member of our board of directors, and has been a leader in the natural resources field in Maine for 5 decades. Alec served as the director of the Maine Forest Service, member of the Baxter State Park Authority, director of LRC, and worked in the Natural Resources Division of the State Planning Office, and founded the consulting firm Land and Water Associates. Alec is currently working with the New England Forestry Foundation on research and policy related to exemplary forestry and the role that forests can play in mitigating climate change. So Alec, you want to give everybody a wave so they know who you are? Yeah. All right. Thanks, Alec. Our second speaker this evening is Jensen Bissell. Jensen is the former director of Baxter State Park and a current member of our board of directors. Jensen trained as a forester at the SUNY School of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, spent a decade working as a forester on federal land for the Bureau of Land Management in the Cascades in Oregon before moving to Maine to take a job at Baxter State Park in 1986. So Jensen spent almost 20 years managing the SFMA in the park, and most of the management practices currently in place in the SFMA, from the management plan to ecological reserves, silvicultural practices you'll hear about tonight, were either developed or put in place by Jensen during his tenure. Jensen then served as park director from 2005 to 2017. So thanks, Jensen. Our third speaker is Nava Tabak, who currently serves as Baxter State Park's Natural Resource Director. Nava is a conservation scientist with expertise in climate resilience, GIS, environmental education, visitor issues, forest management. She holds a degree in environmental studies from Ithaca College and a master's in ecology from University of Connecticut. And Nava joined the Baxter staff in November 2021. Is that right, Nava? Yeah, coming up on 2 years. And she has worn so many hats in the almost 2 years since then, in addition to her own as the park's natural resource director. And Nava oversees the protection of all of Baxter State Park's natural resources. So let that sink in for a minute. That is no small feat, given that the park is one of the largest and most ecologically valuable protected areas in the eastern United States. Nava oversees that important work on behalf of the park. Our fourth speaker is Shane Miller. Shane joined the Baxter State Park staff as lands manager in this past February. And Shane provides leadership for all aspects of the SFMA with a focus on long-term sustainability and scientifically sound silviculture. Shane graduated summa cum laude from UMaine with a degree in forestry. And since then, he's worked as a forester for Huber Resources Corporation, a forestry field crew leader, and a wildland firefighter for the U.S. Forest Service. So thanks. Shane, you want to give a wave? Is it you? All right. So we are so incredibly fortunate to have each of these 4 speakers with us tonight. This is truly a dream team to talk about the SFMA. I can't imagine a group of 4 people more qualified to help us understand the SFMA than these folks on your screen. So thanks, everyone. I'm going to go through some brief Zoom logistics, and then I'll call you each back in as your section is about to start. So before we begin, just a few brief notes on logistics. We are in webinar format in Zoom, and many of us are old hands at this by now, but webinar format means that you can see us and see everything that's happening on screen, but we cannot see or hear you. So your video is not coming through, or your audio. You don't need to worry about dogs barking and background noise because we're in webinar format. We will be sharing screens throughout this presentation, and I'm going to be managing that from my computer. If you can only see a portion of the images that are on screen, you do have the ability to adjust the view on your end to either zoom in or zoom out so that you can see either see the entire image if some of it's cut off, or you can zoom in if things look too small for you. And those controls, if you're on a computer, are right up at the top of your screen. You can change the zoom level. So I encourage you, as we're going through the presentations, to adjust that so that it looks right for you. Please use the meeting chat for any tech issues. If you have any problems, please reach out to Mary in the chat, and she can help you troubleshoot. I will be serving as timekeeper and moderator and fielding questions during our event tonight. And we will have at least 15 minutes of dedicated time for questions at the end. So you'll have the opportunity to direct your question to any of our presenters. And I would ask you to hold questions for the end. If you look down at the bottom of your screen and see the little icon that says Q&A, if you tap on that, you can actually type your question and it'll just be saved in the system. And then when we get to the Q&A time, I will go through our list of questions and so that the presenters can field them. So if typing doesn't work well because of the device you're on or for any other reason, and you'd like to ask your question out loud, if you look down at the bottom of your screen, there's a raise hand button. Once we get to our Q&A time, if you raise your hand, I will call on you, and I can actually enable your audio so you can just ask your question out loud and ask it verbally to the presenter. So that's an option for you as well. So if anyone has any questions, please reach out to Mary in the chat. And I do want to mention, just unless I forget at the end, we are obviously on Zoom tonight, but we are hosting an in-person tour in the SFMA on Friday, October 27th. And if you're interested in participating in that tour, there may still be space available. We're rapidly reaching capacity. But please, you can visit friendsofbaxter.org/SFMA for more information, and you can register or join the wait list by email, and the information is all on that webpage. So again, any questions, please ask Mary in the chat. So without any further ado, I want to welcome our first speaker, Alec Giffen, who is going to give us some context and background on Maine's forests, past, present, and future. Take it away, Alec.
Thank you, Aaron. And thank you all who are participating. It's great to see the scientific forest management area getting its due. Just by way of introduction, I think you'll hear more about this from Jensen, but Percival Baxter truly was an extraordinary person. He was independent, he was public spirited, he was fiercely protective of Maine's interests, and most people don't know that he played a key role in hydropower development in the state of Maine, and making sure that the hydropower was not destined for out-of-state interests. It was a major issue as far as he was concerned. He was a visionary, not only in that regard, but as regards the park, clearly. And he was one of those people who could hold two competing ideas in his head, the importance of wildlands and the importance of working forests. In addition to that, he was also a devoted dog lover, and he kept his dogs in the governor's office. When I served in state government, the scratches from one of his dogs were still in the doors. They were retained for historic reasons. He got into a bit of hot water when he flew the state flag at half-mast when one of his dogs died, and that created a bit of a public outcry over his behavior. Anyway, he was an incredible person, and we owe him a huge debt of gratitude for what he did as regards Baxter State Park. So next slide. Okay, so it's important to recognize that Maine's forests have changed very significantly over time. So 20,000 years ago, the last ice age, the ice was about a mile thick over the state of Maine, including going over the top of Mount Katahdin. And some of the early geologists were puzzled by the scratches that they found on the top of Mount Katahdin. And to show you, I think, how far we've come in terms of scientific understanding, some of the original explanations were that it was from chunks of ice that were floating in Noah's flood. So I think we've made a bit of progress on the scientific side. And you'll see in the picture there where the state of Maine was located, we were under, as I say, about a mile of ice. Next. After the ice retreated about 12,000 to 14,000 years ago, the state of Maine was covered by tundra, and then trees grew and spruce occupied the state. Next, 6,000 years ago, the state was much warmer, and pine forests with oak, which, by the way, is the direction that we're headed currently, were dominant. And that they then gave way to spruce again as the climate cooled during the Little Ice Age. So spruce has been prominent in northern Maine really only over the last 1,000 years or so, but previously it also existed. Next, 250 years ago, the state of Maine was renowned for its very large pine trees, which made it the envy of navies all over the world. And big pines were marked with the broad arrow shown here to keep them for the British Navy. And in fact, the masts for the US Constitution were floated down the Sheepscot River, as I recall. Timber and firs were the resources of this area. 170 years ago, large pines were cut throughout Maine and driven down the Penobscot and Kennebec rivers primarily. So here's a couple of pictures of river drives. You can see people working on a log jam in the one on the upper right, and a bateau assisting, which was basically like a river dory. Anyway, very big pines. They went in, they didn't cut anything else, just took the pines and drove them down the rivers. Next. Bangor was the largest lumber port in the world in the 1850s. And word was that when the logs were in, you could walk from one side of the river to the other on top of the logs. And that certainly seems like it was possible in this picture. So, and Maine was, of course, the birthplace of Babe the Blue Ox and all of the legends about logging, the logging culture. 120 years ago, a fellow by the name of Hugh Chisholm founded paper mills along the Androscoggin River and went on to have paper mills in Canada, and he formed International Paper Company basically, this was the age when if you had enough money, you could work to try and control the competition with your product, and Hugh Chisholm was of that school of thought. Maine was a global leader up through the 1960s in paper production, admired all over the world. One paper product that you may not be aware of is when you look at the dashboard of your car or the seats in your car, you see that it has a pattern. Well, that pattern was created by a paper that was invented in Maine and produced by S.D. Warren, and still is, at their mill down on the Presumpscot River. And it was a paper that had a continuous pattern on it, and plastic is poured on that continuous pattern on the paper and makes up the naga hide, et cetera, that we're all very familiar with. 70 years ago, pulp was king, and a handful of companies owned half of the state of Maine, which is about a quarter of New England, about 10 million acres. The wood coming down the rivers, because it was all moved by water at that point, was softwood only, and most all of it came down the rivers in the spring. There were extensive series of dams created all over the unorganized territories of Maine. The logs were piled up, and then when the spring freshet came, the dam's water was released and the wood came down the river. Typically, farmers would go up into the woods when farming was done in the fall, and they would walk to the sites where timber was being harvested. They'd spend the entire winter, and then they would come back home to farm in the spring, and some of them would run the wood down the river to the mills. 50 years ago, ushered in the age when wood came to the paper mills via trucks. So this was when the major roads were established all over the unorganized territories. There's about 20,000 miles of roads in the unorganized territories. This was prompted by two things. One, the paper companies discovered that they could make better paper with fresh wood. And the second thing was that river driving was outlawed in, I believe it was 1975, in a lawsuit that was brought by a Bangor resident by the name of Howard Trotsky. So this resulted in approximately 20,000 miles of road being constructed. And an important implication of this was that now hardwood could be brought to the mills, because you can't drive hardwood downstream when it's green because it sinks. But with the advent of road access to the mills, you could use hardwood, and that was quickly incorporated into the paper making process. And this was about the time that I started my career in Maine with the Land Use Regulation Commission. And at that time, I did a pretty thorough review of the publication from the U.S. Forest Service called The Timber Resources of Maine, and discovered that except for spruce fir, which were pretty heavily harvested, but at sustainable levels, Maine's forest was growing about twice as much wood as what was being harvested. Okay, 40 years ago, spruce budworm hit the state. This is a native insect. It's not an introduced insect. It comes on about 40-year cycles, but the management of the forest strongly influences how bad the outbreaks are of budworm. And in the 1970s and 80s, we had a lot of overmature fir, which is the preferred food of the spruce budworm, misnamed, obviously. And we saw the advent of what were called rolling clear cuts. where you could go up in an airplane, and except for riparian zones and some deer wintering areas, the clear cuts went from one horizon to the other. This sparked two major concerns. In the case of the forest products industry, the concern was with the future supply of spruce and fir, and on the part of the public, it was the forest practices that resulted in this kind of management, which they did not see as beneficial. 25 to 30 years ago, a fellow by the name of Sir James Goldsmith, he probably wasn't the first one who discovered it, but he acted upon it, and that was that the paper companies, which were vertically integrated at that time, meaning that went all the way from power production to owning land and to owning the mills, that they were worth more if you broke them up into their component pieces and sold them. And so that's what happened. And all of the major companies went through it. The lands were sold, and the mills were sold, and in some cases, the power production was sold separately. The power production was a huge asset. At one point in time, Great Northern Paper Company had the largest privately owned hydropower system in the United States. So, sale of the paper company lands. There were also two forest referenda, which were turned down ultimately by the voters. But in the end, there was a Forest Practices Act that was enacted to essentially control clear cuts, which have largely been eliminated as a major cutting practice in the state. There are some exceptions, but it's nowhere near at the scale that it used to be. Today, stocking levels are far less than ideal. It turns out that the new owners, in many cases, what are called TIMOs, Timber Investment Management Organizations, are really driven by returns to investors, and that means cutting wood. And so you'll see here, the orange bars represent what forest ecologists and forest silviculturalists recommend as the percentage of the forest that ought to be in these different age classes, starting with regeneration over on the left and finishing up with very old forests on the right. And you'll see that we have far more regeneration and pole timber size, that's middle size timber, than we should. We have far too little saw timber, and we have way, way too little of large diameter complex stands. This is in part as a result of the spruce budworm outbreak, and we'll be recovering as we go forward here. But we're not in a kind of an optimum position, even for growing timber. Next slide, Aaron. So what this shows is that as stocking levels go up from left to right, you increase the amount of wood that is grown, and hence you increase the amount of timber that you can cut. And we're currently down where that little red diamond is in terms of stocking, and so that the stocking levels are not really ideal for timber production, nor are they ideal for habitat for a variety of different species. And this actually creates an opportunity presently for restocking those forests. And now that carbon is a valuable commodity and predicted to get very valuable within the next 10 years, there may be really strong incentives for people to restock the forests and capitalize on the carbon markets. Next. So again, today, many people, when they used to call me when I was state forester, they would see an important question as being, so how many trees do you plant in Maine? And the answer is very, very few. And that's because if you cut an acre of Maine forest, you can get as many as 40,000 seedlings established as a result of doing nothing other than cutting the forest. So the regeneration of trees in Maine is not a problem, but regenerating the right trees for each site and at the right densities is a very significant problem. And I'll talk a bit more about that a little further on here. Maine's forest products industry has the potential for new products. A number of them are listed there, and there's interest in doing all of these, and there are proposals moving forward. The picture that's shown there is of the first in the world 3D printed house, which was done by the University of Maine at Orono on a huge 3D printer that they have. Cross-laminated timber is also an up-and-coming product, and there are plans in parts of Scandinavia to build whole new towns with cross-laminated timber. There is also the potential for growing far more wood in the Maine woods, and the picture there that's shown is of me standing next to a approximately 25-year-old larch tree, which are fully saw timber size and ready for harvest in 25 years. Next. So the fundamental problem with practicing better silviculture in Maine is financial returns. Doing the best job that you can requires investing money up front, and the paybacks are too long. So the discount rates mean that it does not make sense for private landowners who are motivated strongly by financial interests and concerns for their stockholders, and they're not incentivized to do it. So the stand that's shown on the right there is a 40-year-old stand. It came in after a clear cut during the budworm era. Nothing has been done to it. It is in terrible shape, really, to institute any kind of management because the stems are far too many per acre. They're small tops. They're got small root masses, so they're not wind firm. And it's hard to know what to do with a stand like that. And it'll be decades before it is able to produce a valuable crop of timber. We really suffer from lack of markets for small diameter and low value wood. And the reason is if you had those markets, you then would have the financial ability to get into these stands before they get to this condition and thin them so that the trees develop better. Carbon markets are beginning to compete with timber management. That's a concern. Big blow up over in New Hampshire, where the northern part of the state has been bought up by a company that's really focused on carbon, and local people are very concerned with whether or not timber management is going to continue. Next slide, Aaron. So what about the future? And the picture on the left is the same one that you saw in the previous slide. The picture on the right is 100 yards away, same soils, same aspect, same slope. The difference is that the one on the right was pre-commercially thinned and early commercially thinned, and hence it will be ready for harvest in 10 years. And those logs can go into long life wood products, which will help reduce climate change. Next, improved silviculture can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, improve wildlife habitat, and produce more wood. Next slide. This is a map that shows the timber stocking of forest lands throughout New England. And you'll note that the light green area, which reflects lower stocking, occupies most of the unorganized territories in Maine and stands in stark contrast with southern New England, where there's a lack of management. And the need there is really to start to initiate management and improve wildlife habitat and get some timber flows and improve resistance and resilience of the forests to climate change, which is going to be increasingly important as the number and severity of storms increases in the future of all kinds, ice storms, hurricanes, tornadoes, etc. Next slide. This slide shows what you can do if you practice better forestry in terms of carbon stocks. And the take-home message here is that within about 25 years, you can increase the carbon stocking per acre by about 30 metric tons CO2e per acre. That's the conventional unit of measure. And if you think about all of those acres that are shown in that light green in the previous slide, this kind of management could be accomplished and would really do a great deal to mitigate climate change. And I'll come back to that in the end here. Next slide. So, is it possible to both increase carbon storage and maintain harvest? The answer is yes. And here's a series of case studies that come from, in most cases, land managed by the New England Forestry Foundation. The gray bar at the top, if you just look at the top set of bars, the gray bar is what was there initially. The bar below that is timber stocking after management. And in this case, the management period is probably about 50 years on this forest. And the bar at the bottom is what was harvested. So bottom line is there was a lot of wood harvested, but still by careful management, you could increase stocking. Same thing on, if you look at the last set of bars down, which is not an F forest, it's a forest managed by Bob Seymour and previous to him by Ron Locke to practice essentially the same kind of forestry. So it is possible. So exemplary forestry, next slide, which is what NEF calls its approach to forestry, is active forest management that's positive for the full suite of forest values. Now, this is not instead of ecological reserves, it's along with ecological reserves. We need both. Just as Governor Baxter felt we needed wilderness areas, we need ecological reserves, and we also need actively managed forest lands to produce wood, because using wood reduces greenhouse gas levels because it's a far less energy intensive material than concrete, steel, or plastic. Next slide. So exemplary forestry includes, among other things, harvesting that respects aesthetic values. And I have long felt that this is really a key to getting public acceptance of what we do. If what we do looks like hell, then we're going to have a hard time convincing the public that it's okay. Now, I would hasten to add that there are things that don't look particularly good, like leaving snags or leaving slash in the woods, which are, and leaving large logs down, what's called coarse woody debris. And those are ecologically beneficial things, but they don't look good. However, we can go a long way toward, even with including those things within the forest landscape, making our cutting operations look better. The picture that's shown here is of selection management, which a lot of people would hold up as being the best thing that you could do This is 20-year reentry selection management. And note in the paragraph below there that the financial return calculated as net present value for the management of that stand over a period of probably about 60 years is about $540 per acre. Keep that in mind when we go to the next slide, which shows management, which is called Logger's Choice. And basically, as soon as things get to be commercially valuable, they get cut. And the sad news here is the net present value of this kind of management is almost $1,000 per acre over the same period of time. This is why we have a problem, is that the financial system that we have does not incentivize good forestry. And that's something that we need to change, and we're working on that. New paragraph, or new slide. Okay, so exemplary forestry includes management from umbrella wildlife species. These are wildlife species that represent the needs of a lot of other species. In the Acadian forest, which is the northern part of Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, one of those species is the American marten, which requires square mile blocks of basically continuous cover forestry that runs heavily to conifers. And so exemplary forestry calls for, I believe it's 16% of the landscape to be managed for American marten. On the other hand, the next slide shows the Canada lynx, and what the Canada lynx needs in order to raise a litter of kits is to have 15 to 20 acre blocks of young forest that runs heavily to spruce fir. And the reason for that is that the female lynx needs that area, which will produce large quantities of snowshoe hare to feed her young. So good wildlife management is not strictly continuous cover forestry. If you want to represent the interests of all the different species that we have here in Maine, you need some patch cuts as well as continuous cover forestry. Next, Aaron. Exemplary forestry also includes protecting special habitats and ecological reserves, as I mentioned. Next slide. The specifications for exemplary forestry can be reduced down to a couple of pages. So, for example, just looking at one of them that are here, and these are measurable metrics that you need to have 5 to 15% of the stands in seedlings, 30 to 40% in saplings and poles, and 45 to 50% in saw timber. And it's desirable to have about 10% in large diameter multi-storied stands. And those stand conditions are all things that are needed for different forms of wildlife. So we've reduced exemplary forestry down to a set of measurable metrics. Next. So a key issue above and beyond finances is that the public attitudes toward practicing forestry. And I've been struck recently by the fact that my grandkids watch a fair number of videos, not too many, but some. And over the course of the last year, I've noticed that a number of them feature cutting trees and loggers as the villains. It's embedded in our culture that we see cutting trees as being something which is destructive, which it does not need to be. It can, in fact, be very constructive, but we have yet to convince the public of that. The Europeans are way ahead of us on this issue. They went through a timber famine back in the 15th century where they were running out of firewood and people were out collecting twigs in the forest to keep themselves warm. They understand the importance of practicing good forestry. We, because of the abundance of our forest resources, haven't really grappled with that up to this point. And also, a lot of what you see out there when you travel around and look at forestry is not really attractive. And what people notice are the things that are not attractive. They don't notice the good forestry. Even my own family, we drive down the road, I'll be looking out and saying, wow, they really did a good job over there. And my partner and my kids are just kind of oblivious to it, unless I point it out, which I do quite frequently. Okay, so next slide, and this is the last one. So going back to the issue of increasing carbon storage in the forest, it turns out that practicing better forestry, and this is borne out by 2 other studies beyond those done by NEF, could be about 30% of the solution to getting to net zero in New England. And that's what these wedges show. The biggest part of the wedge is the improved forest management, restocking those forests. And that comes from increasing that stocking to 30 additional tons per acre of CO2e on about 12 million acres of land in New England. So I'll close with that and be happy to answer questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Alec.